Welcome back to Logic Basics. Last series we went through was a series on skepticism. And one of the things we needed to cover in that series that we didn't yet cover is the informal fallacies. Remember, the informal fallacies lead to skepticism insofar as they assume that if pseudo-argument doesn't succeed, then no argument will succeed. So now we need to look at these pseudo-arguments. Peter Kreeft's book that I mentioned early on, here we go, the Socratic Logic book, has at least 49, if not 52, when you count them, informal fallacies. So I encourage you to look at that book and read for a more extensive list. What we're going to look at is a list of the top 12. So let's take out this handout called Informal Fallacies, and I'm going to read through the handout and encourage you to find examples of these. Each semester I encourage students to write down an example of each of these that they see out in their daily life, whether talking to friends, at work, on the internet, reading blog posts or internet sources of some sort. So you'll start to see these everywhere. And again, we're trying to clean up the discourse. Remember, this is one of my goals in life, and we can do that by not using pseudo-arguments. We want to use a real argument. So let's begin by identifying pseudo-arguments, eliminating them from our use, and identifying them when we can, and not letting others use them on us. Part of using an informal fallacy is a subtle denial of a person's human dignity. You're failing to recognize them as capable of using reason and argument, and so we use an emotional appeal or a direct appeal to the will instead. So I want you to notice those emotional and or appeals to the will in these examples. We'll just go through each one. I'll try to give some examples, but I want you to look for examples out there. All right, so the first one is the appeal to fear. I might have to tell a story with this one. Appeal to fear is the use of threat to persuade to action. Do it or else, right? It succeeds where one fears losing a secondary good over a primary good. And it was used against Socrates unsuccessfully. So I feel like I should tell the story of Socrates. If you have not yet read the Apology by Plato, you should do that. Plato's Apology is a dialogue that is, the circumstances are Socrates' trial. He has been found to be teaching things that corrupt the youth of Athens and are not consistent with the gods of Athens. Those are the accusations, all right? So let me just tell you the story of Socrates. Socrates is on trial when he's about 70 years old, and he has been doing philosophy in Athens, asking hard questions for probably about 50 years. He's going around asking hard questions to those who appear to have knowledge. Socrates wants to know. He wants to know what is. So when he was younger, he got commissioned by the god, basically, to do this. One of his students was at the Oracle of Delphi. That's where the gods communicate with humans. And the Oracle said to this young person, or I guess maybe the young person asked the Oracle, who's the wisest person? And the Oracle said, Socrates is the wisest. And so this young person went back to Socrates and said, hey, Socrates, the Oracle said you're the wisest man. And Socrates, being the good philosopher that he is, said, I wonder what that could mean. He didn't go out and say, that's right, I'm wise. He didn't say, no, I'm not. He said, I wonder what that could mean. Wonder what the Oracle meant by that. So remember, meaning is more basic than truth. He wants to know what does it mean before he says whether it's true or not. Now, he must have had some inkling about wisdom because A, he was looking for it, and B, he thought he didn't possess wisdom. So he thought maybe there's a mistake here in what the Oracle is saying, and so he wanted to find someone wiser than himself. So he set out on a mission to find wisdom in Athens. So he starts with the politicians. And he went to the politicians and he saw that they were talking about justice. And it would be neat to have knowledge about justice, right? So he says, you politicians, you talk about justice. What is justice? And the politicians gave a lot of examples of just actions and what just doings would look like, just deeds. And he said, no, not examples. What is justice in itself? What is justice? That's a good question, right? Have you ever thought of that question? What is justice? Well, it turns out the politicians were not able to answer Socrates' question. So he concluded, okay, these politicians are using words, but they don't really know what they mean, and maybe they don't have wisdom. And I should add that Socrates always has a group of young people following him around and witnessing his discussions with others, and the young people saw that these people in authority didn't have knowledge, where they had a position of authority, but they didn't know what they were talking about. And so the young people probably took their authority down a couple notches in their mind, like, yeah, these guys don't know what they're talking about. Socrates next goes to the poets of his day, which are like the rock stars of our day, and he says, you rock stars, you talk about beauty. What is beauty in itself? Now, the poets, they knew what beautiful language was, and they knew what beauty appeared to be, but the reality of beauty was far from their minds, and they couldn't define beauty. And so Socrates again concludes these people don't know what they're talking about. They're using words without understanding. And he went next to the craftsmen, which are like the scientists of his day. And again, he found that they could make neat things and they could, make iPhones and stuff, but they didn't have knowledge of the nature of reality. And so after doing this for his lifetime, people started to get upset with him, showing them up in public, showing they lacked insight, but they were in positions of authority. And so he finally is brought to trial on the charges of corrupting the youth and teaching about strange gods. Now that's what the apology is about, and they find him guilty. The Athenian government is a pure democracy, and they find him, the majority find him guilty of these charges. He's up for sentencing, and they ask him, hey, what should your sentence be? And he thinks that the Athenians should pay him, that they should support him like they support the Olympians who are victors in their sports. But they decide, no, your penalty is stop doing philosophy or die. So that's where the appeal to fear comes in. Stop doing philosophy or you will have to die, the death penalty, right? Now, for a number of reasons he gives, Socrates can't stop doing philosophy. So he chooses death. Now, this is where it comes in. So it's the use of threat to persuade to action. Notice, this isn't an argument. He gave many arguments as to why he is not corrupting the youth. He does believe in the gods, and that he is doing a service to Athens. So he gave them arguments. They did not give counter arguments. Instead, they used this informal fallacy, and they threatened his life. Now, it didn't succeed against Socrates. Why? Because he had a primary good that he thought was more important than his physical life. What is that primary good? His intellectual life, his spiritual life. The meaning he got through doing philosophy was more important to him than was his physical well-being. Right? So that was a long story to give you an example of the appeal to fear. It was used against Socrates unsuccessfully. And I'm giving you this example because it happened to Socrates in a very dramatic way, but it happens to us in more subtle ways. And I think it's happening right now. So in our public discourse, we may be afraid to talk. We may be afraid to speak up because someone could use an appeal to fear against us. Saying the wrong thing on Twitter could cause you to lose your job, or offending someone could cause you to get reported to your boss, right? So this is very popular right now, and I think if we keep our eyes on the good, the primary good, over a secondary good, maybe we can overcome these appeals to fear. All right, appeal to pity is the next one. This is also very popular right now. Appeal to pity is the abuse of the listener's disposition to compassion. It succeeds where the good of the recipient is not kept clearly in mind, and it is often used to avoid responsibility where hardship is necessary. So let's think about this. The appeal to pity can be used on a number of levels, and I want you to think critically about this. So notice it has to do with compassion. It assumes that we have a modicum of compassion, but then it presses our compassion over the boundaries. So it also succeeds where we don't keep the good of the recipient clearly in mind. Now I'm going to give you an example of where I see these. I see these on the day before exams or the day after exams, where students come to me and they say, oh, I couldn't study for the exam. I had to work 40 hours last week. And it's kind of sad sometimes. And I do understand students do have hardships and they have hard lives. But if I don't keep in mind that I set down guidelines in the syllabus, and one of those guidelines was studying 2 hours outside of class for every hour in class. So having to work 40 hours the past week doesn't explain the previous 3 weeks before the exam where the student could be studying. I give exams every 4 weeks in class. So if I don't keep the good of the student in mind, then I will give in to the appeal to pity and I will harm myself and the student by not abiding by reason, but giving into feelings. So the appeal to pity is getting at your feelings. It's an emotional appeal. Now notice, it is often used to avoid responsibility where hardship is necessary. So sometimes parents, sometimes teachers, sometimes friends have to use tough love. And that's a way to not fall prey to the appeal to pity. Okay, and this is tough. One professor says that we're living in an age of feeling right now. I was resistant to that until recently, where I thought, maybe he's right. We're living in an age of feeling where we use compassion rather than reason, or our disposition to compassion rather than reason to persuade people. So be on your guard and also look for examples. I'm not giving you very much by way of example because I want you to go look for the examples. Bring them to me, because I love reading funny ones. Okay, let's talk about the straw man argument. A straw man argument is arguing against a misrepresentation of a position rather than the real thing. So we set up our opponent and knock it down as if it were a straw man in a field and we were fighting it, and then we claim victory. Like, yeah, I beat up that position, when really it wasn't a position anyone would honestly hold to. So honesty and care are necessary to avoid the use of the straw man. In philosophy, this is called the principle of charity. The principle of charity states that you should give the best possible reading of a position with which you disagree and then argue against that. So pick the strongest representation of a position rather than the weakest representation. I see this straw man arguing in political discourse a lot right now. If you disagree with somebody, they're a racist or a Nazi or extremist of some sort, or they're a Marxist, right? So if you were to talk to the person, then you might understand their actual position. Or if you were to read history, maybe you'll find the actual representation. A lot of arguments against religion are of the straw man variety. So politics and religion, it's easy to fall into a straw man. It's best to find the historic position and argue against that, or talk to the person that you disagree with and try to understand what they actually mean, what they actually believe, and argue against that. All right, and that's one way we can clean up the discourse out there. Okay, appeal to authority. This is appealing to someone as an authority where he or she is not an authority. This is often used where there's an insufficient respect for the authority of reason. So we have to come to terms with the fact that sometimes people are authorities in certain areas. But but then that authority and insight that they have in one area may not carry over to another area. For example, a lot of times in class, I have students appealing to scientists in matters of philosophy. It seems to me people like Stephen Hawking are authoritative people in the area of physics. But when Stephen Hawking starts to talk about philosophy, it seems like he's crossed over into another field where he's not an authority. He has spoken about philosophy, incidentally, in one of his books. Now, I would like you to think about other examples of this. So people might have authority in one area, but appealing to them for authority in other areas is when we make this appeal to authority. Okay, so and it's because we're making a person the authority rather than reason the authority. Remember, we talked about reason is transcendental, it's authoritative and self-attesting. So reason should be the authority we can all appeal to, not a person. Okay. All right, ad hominem. This is so rampant right now. Let's talk about this one. An ad hominem is speaking against the person rather than against what the person said. It's a personal attack, often used when we don't have a counter argument. Now, I notice sometimes this happens when people are in a discussion and they've gotten into a corner that they can't get out of in terms of counter arguments. They don't have a comeback. The ad hominem comes out. Oh yeah, well you're just a freshman. Oh yeah, well you're a jerk. Now that's one way it could happen, but it could also happen in terms of slander, libel. I'm trying to think of how it comes out on the internet, where people will go after your character assassination. That's what I was looking for. Political people, again, let's look at all the bad stuff people have done and use that against them rather than saying, hey, this is what the person stands for, this is the platform that they're backing, let's argue against that. So ad hominem literally means against the man, against the person, okay? So ad hominem, against the person. So instead of arguing against the person, let's argue against what the person has said. That's safer and more honest and more affirming of human dignity, treating the person as a person who has actually said something and believes something. Okay, this next one is ad populum. This is very popular as well right now. This is relying on the tendency of people to believe or go along with what is commonly accepted or done. It succeeds against those who find safety in numbers or custom or the establishment. Okay, this is groupthink. The group says this, I don't want to be outside the group, so I'm going to go with what the group believes. Notice, it's still based on feelings. I don't want to feel outside. I don't want to, feel left behind. I don't want to be outside the norm. I don't want to be the weirdo. Now, the numbers could be wrong. What if there's a large number of poor thinkers and they're saying something? Do you want to go along with that just because it's more comfortable? Is comfort better than truth? So think about that. Ad populum. I think this is the informal fallacy of our teenage years. Teenagers, at least when I was a teenager, tended to go along with the group or wanting to be popular. Okay. Now there may be a knee-jerk reaction to be different just to be different. That may be a different problem. So ad populum, we don't want to fall into that as a form of an argument. Okay, begging the question. This one is maybe a little more difficult to spot out there, but begging the question is assuming to be true what one claims to be proving to be true. And it's used often where a person is not aware of his or her assumptions. So sometimes when we're in an argument, we're trying to prove something, but we don't recognize that we're assuming the very thing we should be proving. I'll give you two examples that I thought in the past were sort of flimsy, but I have seen them over and over and over again. So here's one example. A person might say, well, I believe in God. And another person might say, why do you believe in God? And the first person says, well, because of the Bible. And the second person might say, well, why do you believe in the Bible? And the first person says, because it's the Word of God. So notice we go from God to the Bible to God. And the Bible assumes God, it doesn't prove God. So that's a circular argument. Okay, that's begging the question. You should be proving God outside of the Bible. All right, another example I've seen is an example from maybe geology. Here we find an old layer of rock. Well, how do you know this is an old layer of rock? Well, because it has old bones in it. Well, how do you know that those are old bones? Well, because they're in an old layer of rock. Now, I was once a geology major and I thought this was ridiculous, but I actually read that in a book at one point. So people do use that kind of arguing. But these are two very clear examples of begging the question. Sometimes they're more subtle. So I want you to keep your eye out for begging the question. And I always tell my students this is the cardinal sin of philosophers. If a philosopher begs the question, then that's bad, because they're supposed to be aware of their assumptions. So notice this is where a person is not aware of their assumptions. Philosophers should be the most aware of their assumptions, and oftentimes they aren't. So begging the question, let's avoid that. All right, red herring. Now this is something that happens often in my classes. Sometimes I let it happen on purpose to see where we're going. But a red herring is sidetracking the argument by bringing in what is irrelevant. And it's often based on associative thinking rather than logical thinking, and taking things out of the original context. Now, a red herring could be something that is done purposefully to sort of distract a person, or it could be done in a way that a person is not conscious of doing it. So in class, for example, we will be talking about something, and then the students will say, oh, that reminds me of this time, me and my friends, and we're off on a rabbit trail now. That's associating this idea with that idea, where they're not logically connected. And in logic class, we're trying to train ourselves into logical thinking. Sometimes if you're watching interviews on the news, this happens all the time. A person will ask a direct question, and the person on the other side of the interview, the interviewee, will give an answer that had nothing to do with the question, almost like they were avoiding the question. So that's an example of a red herring. Go look for them. They're everywhere. They are everywhere, and you will start to go, I feel more confident and competent in the use of reason. I'm seeing these informal fallacies everywhere. All right, appeal to ignorance. All right, appeal to ignorance is assuming a belief to be true if it has not been disproven. It sometimes involves an appeal to the unknown through the use of undefinable terms. Okay, so appeal to the unknown is probably the primary thing to look for here. Maybe in a discussion with someone about philosophical issues, maybe even metaphysics, and you ask them, oh, well, in your view, where did everything come from? And they say, oh, well, nobody can really know that. That's a form of an appeal to an unknown. How did the Big Bang start? Nobody really knows. That's an appeal to the unknown. All right, so I will let you look for examples of appeal to ignorance out there. Post hoc is, the Latin is post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. So it's about causal reasoning. So after this, therefore, because of this, it's faulty causal reasoning based on insufficient observation or analysis. Sometimes we say causality, correlation doesn't equal causation. That's how it goes. Correlation doesn't equal causation. That's noticing a faulty causal reasoning. Now, this is maybe a lot of superstition is post hoc explanation. Sometimes you see it in health. Yeah, I ate this certain food. Now I feel sick. That certain food caused me to be sick. Is that Is that the only cause? So notice it has to be based on sufficient observation to not be a post hoc. This is insufficient observation or analysis. Okay? Hasty generalization. All right, this one is making a general statement based on insufficient observation, often involved in stereotyping. Notice it's a general statement based on insufficient observation again. Making claims about a group of people where you haven't observed enough of them to make that kind of claim. And you know what stereotyping is. I'll let you think about that. I'm just going to move on because we're getting long here. Complex question is our last informal fallacy. A complex question is a question that assumes more than the listener is ready to assent to, also known as the loaded question. Now, the basic logic book that I used when I was a student had an example. When are you going to stop beating your wife? Right? That's an example of a complex question. When are you going to stop coming to class high? These are kinds of questions you can't just answer yes or no to, and as soon as you start answering, you're in trouble, right? Because there are assumptions in the question, and it's more than you're willing to admit to. So you should say, I'm sorry, that's a loaded question or a complex question. Can you rephrase the question? All right, now, these are some of the informal fallacies. There are more. But let's work on learning these first, and then we can go online and look up other examples. We can read the Kreeft text to find more examples. But this should be the end of our section on skepticism. Remember, skepticism says that nobody can really know. So the next topic we want to discuss is knowledge. What is knowledge? And is it possible to have knowledge? All right, that's what we're going to do next.